Hello and welcome. This is Mouse Gunner, and we're back with some more Automation the Car Company Tycoon game. And we'll be continuing on with the campaign roleplay of the Edison Car Company in 1991. Now, if you saw my last video, you might be noticing quite a bit of differences right away, and that's because there's been a major update since my last video. And I honestly haven't been paying attention to the development of this game somewhat recently, so this update actually caught me off guard a little bit. And I don't really know all of what it's about, but with a little bit of poking around, I haven't really noticed that many changes to the engine builder, and we're going to be doing an engine build as we have been doing. Now, I'm going to be leapfrogging over one of the models in the Edison Car Company lineup, the Satellite, which is our more economically focused sports car, instead going to our quote-unquote true sports car, the Comet. And the engine we used in 1986, which was the previous year period, was the CV6 86 variant, which is a 3.6-liter V6. And we'll be reproducing that again. So let's go ahead and build that engine from scratch because it is a new year period. Now, if they've added in the functionality where you can take an old engine and just change the year, I'm not aware of it yet, and that's something, again, I'm going to have to do a little bit of research on to see what this update's all about. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and build it from scratch like I've done in every other video in the past. And let's go ahead and switch it to the right year period here. But before I get too much into building this engine, which, as I said, is going to be a V6, let's go ahead and talk about our main competition that I always refer to, and that's Chevrolet. Now, as Chevy is another American car company, and we're an American car company, I think it's good to refer to our competitors. So what I'm going to be referring to is the engines that are in the Corvette, because I feel like that is our direct competition. We're having a sports car. Corvette is the Chevy's sports car. So let's see what they have. So we have the base V8, which is an overhead valve engine with a cast iron block and head. It's a 350 cubic inch displacement, which is roughly 5.7 liters. Its compression ratio is at 10, and it comes with 245 horsepower at 4,000 RPM and 340 foot-pounds of torque at 3,200 RPM. This does come with fuel injection, which is the same thing we'll be using. Now, that horsepower number, I think we can match. But the torque number, I don't know. We'll probably not be able to get too close to that, so they'll probably beat us there. But I think we can beat that horsepower number. The main problem is the second engine I'm going to mention here, which is the engine that's in the ZR1. This is a dual overhead V8, dual overhead cam V8, I should say, with a an aluminum block and head, with a 350 cubic inch displacement as well, which is also roughly 5.7 liters again. Compression ratio comes in at 11, and it produces 375 horsepower at 5,800 RPM and 370 foot-pounds of torque at 4,800 RPM. This also has fuel injection. That engine is going to be hard to beat. First off, we're using a V6. They're using a V8. So, advantage to them, much more displacement, more cylinders, all that is going to be to their benefit. But also, they're using the same thing we're using, which is dual overhead cam. So we lose out a little bit of our advantage there. So I'm thinking probably the main way we're going to compete with that engine is maybe having a turbocharged variant of this engine, which thankfully, this update, from what I've done poking around-wise, allows us to do now, which previously we didn't have that for our V6s. So to reproduce the CV6 family, I need a bore of 92.2 and a stroke of 89.9, which should give us roughly 3.6 liters or 3,600 cc. We need a dual overhead cam engine with 4 valves per cylinder. Also an aluminum head. And did I miss the styling part, or is that later? I think that's later, right? All right. Billet steel, I-beam steel, and forged pistons. Variant capacity is exactly the same as our family. Compression did come in at 9.6. And cam profiles at 48. Keep in mind that this old engine had a carbureted fuel system, not fuel injection, so that is going to be a difference. Styling, let's see what we've got. We only have one choice, and I believe before we used red, so I'll use red for this as well. Moving on, our base engine is going to be naturally aspirated. And as I said, I'm thinking about doing a turbocharged variant. And again, we'll see how this engine does. Now, in the past, we would have had a carburetor, which would have been a 4-barrel twin carb setup. This time around, we're going to use fuel injection, single-point EFI, because that's all what we have. Now, in the other engine, the 86 version, I had a performance intake. I'm going to keep it with the standard intake for now, and we'll see how it does. In the past, I used premium fuel. This time, I'm going to upgrade to super fuel, as it is now available. Our fuel was at 14.9. We might change that around as well. And ignition timing came in at 63. And the RPM limit was at 6,500. We had tubular headers, dual exhaust. It was that diameter, so no changes needed there. High flow, straight through. And that is our V6 as it was set up for 1986, with the only change being the fuel system. So let's go ahead and run this and see how it goes. Okay, without any changes at all, we're already almost matching the horsepower numbers of the base V8 and the Corvette. But again, long way off of the ZR1's numbers. Now, again, whether or not we actually do a turbocharged version, I haven't yet decided. But okay, let's look at what we have. So I'm not noticing any color changes. I'm going to assume the exhaust diameter is probably set up appropriately, which it looks like it is. Now, the fuel system, I, again, thought about doing a performance intake, and that's going to give us a benefit regardless of what everything else is, set up for. But more than likely, we're going to want to change our RPM limit because I don't think we're at where our peak is going to be. And this is going to start causing us to have some reliability issues. We'll put it at our peak for now, which is a long way off. So that's where our peak of performance index is, but as a result, you'll notice the color changes. You'll also notice the big drop in reliability because we were at, with 6,500, we were at 61.2. We dropped down all the way to 55.3, so that's quite a big of a difference. We have to keep in mind we have a lot more fuel octane to work with. But switching from a single-point EFI to, from a dual 4-barrel carb setup to a single-point EFI is actually probably dropped our, and we can even see this real quickly. So if I go to 4-barrel twin carb, you'll notice that our fuel octane, what we have to work with, is actually better with this setup. But you'll notice a bunch of differences, a bunch of downsides. Reliability is a big downside. Weight, I'm going to assume is a downside, although we're not getting a direct comparison here. We're probably getting a direct comparison with a single barrel. So if I switch back over to, and I just got an error, hopefully we're not going to crash. Doesn't look like we crashed, so okay. This update just came out. As a matter of fact, when I was looking into things earlier before I did the recording here, I already had the game crash out on me twice. So hopefully it doesn't crash again. But you just have to keep in mind that this update is pretty recent. So take that into account. So, all right. Because we have higher quality fuel here, though, we will have definitely a lot of fuel octane to still use. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to try and see if I can get that compression ratio up to 10. So we're at least matching what the Chevy V8 is doing. Cam profile-wise, I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do. It might be a good idea to actually back off on it because this would make our power come in a little bit maybe sooner. so we can bring down that red line. The only thing is, though, to really get that to happen, I'm going to have to really modify this cam profile a lot, which is going to really hurt us in our power numbers. And I'm not seeing a whole lot of change in where the power is coming in. It's only changed maybe a couple hundred RPM with all that change. So I think I'm going to keep it where it is and maybe just play with it a little bit. We have to keep in mind that ignition timing will probably change that as well. But I also am not, I'm not liking how much our reliability has dropped. I could just change the red line a little bit. But let's go ahead and play with the ignition timing, maybe even the fuel mixture a little bit here. So for now, what I'm going to do is just go up in the ignition timing. So, well, let's just keep pushing it. Sometimes you have these steps where you actually lose a little bit of power and get negative consequences of going up. And it looks like we're already at our peak. So doing all that really didn't change a whole lot. So with 64, we're at our peak. Let's see what happens when we go up to 68, which I think was our limit of what we could do. So I'm not really noticing that much of a difference between 67 and 64, honestly. So if I come back down to 64, all these numbers look about the same. And that's sometimes you just, with the ignition timing, you reach a point where continuing to upgrade it is not really going to give you that much benefit because usually you have it kind of linked with the cam profile. And you have to kind of balance those two things. So what I might do here, we could go more aggressive with the cam profile. And honestly, I don't think that's going to hurt too much because as long as we don't go change where the power comes in too much, I think we're all right with that. And then I might go up with the compression 1. And then let's see if the ignition timing allows us to get a benefit out of it. Well, I'm going to take 66 anyway, even though it doesn't seem like it's that much of a benefit. It might be a benefit. Yeah, it looks like it's a benefit as far as fuel economy, so it's worth it anyway. Now, where our power comes in is still we're at that peak, but I'm thinking of dropping it back at least one tick so that we are not having as much reliability issues. So I think right there, 6,800 is where I want it. We lose 0.7 in performance index, but I think that's worth it for how much we gain in reliability. Okay, from other changes I could make, I think I'm pretty happy with the performance of this engine. The main things we're going to want to check is with and I didn't make this a performance intake. The main reason I don't really like making things a performance intake is because usually engines that come out of the factory are going to have a standard intake. But we'll go with the performance intake. And how did that change our numbers? So it gave us a few horsepower here. So we're doing better horsepower-wise than the base engine in the Chevy, but again, nowhere near the ZR1 version. Okay, and then finally we're going to check our exhaust diameter, make sure that's still good, which it does look like it is. So 1.75 inches looks like exactly where we want it to be. So let's go ahead and name this engine. And we're going to call it the CV691. And this is a 3.6 liter engine, so I'll just call it the 3.6. And we'll save that. And I'm going to go ahead and put a cut here, and I'm going to install a turbocharge. I'm going to make a turbocharged variant, and I'll come back with that in a bit. And we're back, and I'm going to actually show you the 3.6 liter naturally aspirated engine first, because I made a couple changes to it that are also going to be echoed in the turbocharged version. And that is I changed it to a lightweight forged piston, which made the engine run a little bit smoother, which, as you can see from the color changes, made it run a little bit more reliably. So as a result, I was able to push back up the RPM limit to 6,900 RPM with no real problems. And then I also changed the fuel mixture a little bit because that's something I forgot to do that I wanted to do, just make it a little bit richer. I know I usually run my engines very, very lean because I'm taking advantage of some of the elements of the way that the game calculates things. And I also increased the compression ratio among maybe one or two other minor changes. In any case, that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the turbocharged version. So my end results are 261 horsepower and 243 foot-pounds of torque with the normal engine, the naturally aspirated engine, and with the turbocharged engine. I was able to push that up to 369 horsepower at 6,400 RPM and 355 foot-pounds of torque at 3,900 RPM. So we're getting close or very close to the 375 horsepower that the ZR1 engine, that very scary engine, was producing. So I feel pretty good about this engine. Now, I will admit that I'm still not all that experienced setting up a turbocharger, but this is the way I set it up. Now, one thing I could have done differently is rather than have it be a journal bearing, I could have done ball bearing. But you know what? I might do that because it looks like the power comes in a little bit more smooth. It looks like the main difference is just cost. I also slapped in a large water-to-air intercooler as, you know, I want to get the best I can out of this engine. But in any case, this is how I set up my engine. So it's more or less a little bit. I think I went with the performance preset and then kind of tweaked it from there, made it a little bit, increased some of the settings to make it a little bit more, high power. And as a result, as I said, I get it up to 369 horsepower and 357 foot-pounds of torque, which is pretty good. I ended up going, I didn't show you the compression ratio. You usually have to drop the compression ratio when you have a turbocharged engine. So that came down to 9.1. I think the cam profile is roughly where it's been, and that might actually be something I change here in a second, because I didn't really mess with the cam profile at all, I don't think. But as far as everything else goes, I went with a much richer fuel mixture to get more power out of this engine. The ignition timing actually went down because of knocking issues and wanting to balance things in other ways. Where the peak power comes in is actually the same, so there's no real benefit of changing it. So 6,900 RPM, it stays. Now, the exhaust diameter has gone up quite a lot from what it was before. I think it was 1.75 inches. We increased it by a full inch. So that being said, do I want to mess with the cam profile at all? Let's see. As long as it's not changing where the power is coming in, which it does at that point, I think that's, we're better off for it. So we can get it up to 374 horsepower, which we're just barely outside of that number that I'm looking for. So no, we can't do anything with ignition timing, unfortunately, without it knocking. So I think that's where we're going to keep it. So we did a little bit with the cam profile to make this engine run a little bit more aggressively. Let's make sure the exhaust diameter still is where we want it. Oh, there we go. There's our horsepower. So we were able to push it up to 375 horsepower, which is exactly what we were going for. We're not matching the 370 foot-pounds of torque that the Corvette ZR1 engine was producing, but hey, it's in the ballpark. We were able to do it. Now, economically wise, was that a good choice? We'll have to see here in a second. So let's save that up and look at the engine that we built. Okay. So hop into our engine, sort. So the main engines we're going to be looking at is this one and our previous old engine. And heck, why don't we look at our V8 as well, just to see what kind of numbers we're getting. So our CV6 engine is outperforming both of our V8 variants. The more high-power one would be the one that's in the Constellation, which honestly isn't too surprising, but where the V8s went out is torque, which honestly they were designed for that. I mean, this being in a pickup truck, you're going to want that torque. But comparing it to the previous year period, we're beating it out pretty handedly. We have a significant horsepower gain as well as a torque gain. You'll have to forgive me if I actually don't know what all these symbols mean because they've replaced the old symbology, and I'm going to have to guess here. As I hover over this, it doesn't give me a tooltip. So I'm going to guess this is responsiveness because that sounds right. So responsiveness-wise, we're about the same as we were in the previous periods. So I'm going to assume this is smoothness. And it looks like we've got a pretty significant improvement, but that's because we went with the lightweight forged pistons, which we weren't using before. So I think that's where that difference is. Loudness looks about the same with our naturally aspirated engine as it was in the past, but our turbocharged engine is actually quieter, which is actually somewhat surprising to me because we have a much wider exhaust diameter and things like that, but that's how it turned out. As far as, I think this is reliability, I'm going to guess. And as I discussed with the two 4-barrel carbs, not very reliable in the past, whereas now it's not too bad. It's actually not too far off of our V8s that go on our Constellation or an Asteroid. But we are going to lose quite a bit for the turbocharged engine, but still better than what we were having before. So there is definitely a marked improvement there. Weight-wise, we have a benefit here as well. And again, you're going to consider the lightweight pistons as part of that equation, as well as the advance in years, and also the switch to a fuel injection system from the dual 4-barrel carbs, which I'm sure weighed quite a bit. Now, with a turbocharger, we have quite a bit of weight added on, though. We have a big intercooler in there, and then you have the weight of the turbocharging system itself. So this is adding quite a bit of weight on, but it's still lighter than the V8s that we had. But these are cast iron block and head engines, so not too comparable. I'm going to assume this is fuel economy here, which is a percentage number. And we have an improvement with our base, our naturally aspirated engine, over the old naturally aspirated engine we had before. But our turbocharger really brought that down. We set up the fuel much richer, the fuel system much richer than it was in the past. And also just the way that we set up the engine in general with how aggressive it is, that economy number really has suffered. We're also using a higher quality fuel than we used in the past, which is, I'm assuming, what this is representing. I'm going to assume this is emissions, which we have definitely improved over the past when we were using our carburetors. We've improved this quite a bit. And it also looks like quite a bit of an improvement over our V8s, which are not set up to be aggressive, by the way, which is interesting to see. What is this? Production units, I'm going to assume. So production unit-wise, looks like we're much more expensive here. Interestingly enough, the turbocharged engine is takes less time. Probably, I'm going to assume, because we're using tubular headers here, and we're using the short Kesters because you don't have a choice when you have a turbocharged system in the game. So I'm going to assume that's the difference here. But the difference from this year period to that year period is a big difference in production units. So this engine takes a lot longer to build. Cost-wise, though, we dropped a few hundred, so that's good to see. But the turbocharging system is costing us quite a bit more. Even though it takes us a little less time to make it, it's adding almost 500 onto the cost, and it's 200 plus off of our old engine. So this is definitely more expensive. And we can see that these engines are, although it's not quite as expensive as the Constellation V8 that we have here, it's more expensive than our Asteroid engine. So these are pretty pricey engines, especially the turbocharged variant. But I'm pretty happy with the performance we got and everything out of these engines. And I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. This is Mouse Gunner signing out.